I spent a lot of my time blaming everything on burnout and being tired and being exhausted. And I, but I didn't like address the thing deeper than that. And I wanted to spend some time today just talking about that because I think a lot of times we forget that burnout and being tired and being overwhelmed and all those things aren't the root. Those things are not the biggest uh, problem. It's a signal to a certain issue that's deeper inside. So yeah, this is burnout is not the root. At least that's what I believe. And going back to my own story, I think that's very, very true. So in 2020, I was working at a church as a communications and creative director. And I loved a lot of things about my job, but I also started my job right before COVID hit. And obviously, in that time, we had to pivot when COVID really took off. And just like every other church and every other ministry and every other business and every other organization, we had to switch to this kind of like online model. And I think obviously, everyone was trying to figure it out. And I don't know if anyone ever had it truly figured out, but I do think, that was a time where the creative team at my church, we took a lot on our plate, and we were producing content. We were constantly having to communicate via email, via socials, via you know all of the channels really, and then you're having to produce a service every week, and you know when you don't have the perfect, almost not perfect, but when you don't have the infrastructure for video, um, we the thing we resorted to was kind of just recording and producing a service every week. And while I'm proud of a lot of that work that we did, it was also a lot. And that was to me kind of the start of where this burnout came from. And uh, however, there's always been this sense, as a creative, where we're constantly churning things out and we're constantly doing these things. Even before that job I had, in other prior jobs, and even as my time as a freelance videographer early in my career, that's kind of there was always kind of this symptom of burnout that I kind of always ignored, and I always just kept telling myself, you got to grind and you got to hustle and you got to grit through it all. And I think to some degree that is great. However, there were a lot of issues that came with that. And so as time passed by, um, and we put a lot of work in, there was actually this thing that I didn't realize that grew in my own heart, that while there are other a lot of complex layers to this. When I ended up a few years later leaving the church staff, I realized that I had, and I didn't get the role that I thought I would get and things like that. I really thought, um, I was broken, honestly, and I think that pointed to the bigger root underneath it all. And so for me, that root was I had kind of made this idea, this dream job, this role, my identity. And because of that, and so when everything was kind of taken away from me, it kind of messed me up. And hilariously enough, I had a old mentor of mine, in my college days, warned me about this. And of course, I did not listen, because I was a young man in my 20s. And so I think the interesting about it all is that oftentimes we try to kind of take the symptom and we say, okay, well, we need to treat it and we need to take a vacation and we need to do this trip and we need to take this day off and we need to stop. And I think that is all fair and all very valid. But the issue for me was that I wasn't treating the deeper root underneath, and that was the fact that I was making this position and this role that I wanted my identity. And because of that, I lost the thread of who I was. And so that caused me to not necessarily spiral, but more so uh, feel lost. It made me feel like uh, I couldn't figure out where to go from there. It made me feel directionless. It made me feel like everything I had worked for amounted to nothing, that it was all kind of in vain and it was all wasted. And, I think uh, there was a conversation as I transitioned out of staff back then in 2022 and into another job. I had a friend of mine call me out, and we were talking on the phone, and I was probably, I don't remember the whole thing about the conversation, but this was a pivotal moment, and I'll never forget his words. And I remember he said to me, Freddie, I know this is like all really tough, and I know it's a really hard season and difficult. However, I just feel like I have to say, you don't have to be, you don't have to have the title of a pastor to be a pastor. And it hit me like a ton of bricks. And, that's something that I have heard before in my life. But because of the timing of it, because of everything that was going on, it just hit harder. And the thing underneath all of that is why I'm here making this video today. And that is to remind you, if you're out there and if you feel like you're burned out and you're tired and you're exhausted, and maybe you were in my situation where you felt maybe passed over for a job or a role or a position, and you worked really hard, even but it was given to someone else, or whatever the case, whatever situation you're in today. At least this was the case for me. The case for me was that I thought that my wiring and who I thought I was would fit into this box, and unfortunately it didn't. And what I mean by that is, is exactly what related to what my friend said to me, which was essentially, this role is not your identity. It is not who you are. It is a job. And if I was real, and I feel like a lot of us do this, especially in our Western culture and our American culture, is we make our jobs our identity and who we are. And so that took me on a journey of kind of realizing that, man, like I really had to deprogram some of this idea that like what I did was who I was. And I had to kind of like make a paradigm shift and really figure out, okay, who am I really? And who is what is my identity? And how do I implement that and integrate that throughout every single arena of my life? And so for me, that felt like this idea that when I looked back in my career, everything I did, the heart of everything I did was always about people and always about caring for people and shepherding people, no matter what I did. And whether that was through storytelling and video, whether that was design and how to serve people well through intentional, well thought out user focused design, through branding, through any of the things that I've done, music has always been about people. And I realized that for myself, I just really loved to encourage people and to guide people and to and build them up. And so I've spent a couple of years trying to figure out how to do that and trying to integrate that in my own life. And I think for everybody, it looks different. However, I'm here today to tell you that maybe if you just pause for a second and realize that the burnout is not the only issue here, but if you can take a moment to just dig a little deeper and realize that maybe the cause of your burnout isn't just overworking yourself. I think that's a very obvious cause. However, if you look even deeper, there might be a root that you haven't really noticed that was growing, which is maybe you're like me and you made your job your identity. Maybe you are not only overworked, maybe you are overworked, but maybe that's because you're a people pleaser and you just keep saying yes and you are trying to be everything to everybody. I'm also guilty of that. Maybe there is something deeper going on that you just need to address. And I think that's probably a good place to start when you feel burned out and you feel exhausted and overwhelmed. And so that's a little shorter today, but that's kind of the thought I have today. And so I want to encourage all of you watching this today, um, especially if you're creative. You are not your work. You are more than that, and your identity and the thread of who you are is not just the output that you put out or the pretty things that you make. Uh, your identity is and your wiring is very unique, and um, to attach that to only just a job is probably not the healthiest route. I think that can be like maybe a smidge part of it, but it is not all of who you are. And so I would love to encourage you today to maybe just take a moment and reflect on this idea of, man, my wiring and who I am. How, first of all, what is that? Who am I? And when you start to dig into that, you might start to see this kind of map unfold for you, where uh, you start to see, oh, maybe actually I can be who I am and live out of my identity and who I am instead of what I do. And you can integrate that throughout all these different parts of your life in a really unique way. And so hopefully that's helpful. And I hope everyone has a great one. And I will see you on the next one.